Okay, so today we left off our class talking about the control of homeostasis. Hopefully, by the time you're watching this video, I will have posted the first video from the class we've met this afternoon, and then the second video will be this finishing up of lecture of chapter 1. So we introduced the idea of the different kind of organizational levels of the human body. And then we talked a little bit about the different organs and organ systems. And then we kind of started to expand into how those organ systems are controlled. So homeostasis, again, is going to be that control of kind of sameness of the inside of the human body. So in order to control the inside of the human body, you need to be able to ramp things up and you need to be able to dampen things down. And so the control of that homeostasis is a very delicate balance. So we talked a little bit about this particular slide already a little bit, where you have some kind of stimulus that disrupts homeostasis by increasing or decreasing some type of environmental stimuli, and that controlled condition gets disrupted. So you always are going to have receptors that are expressed on the surface of cells, different cells and tissues. So often when we talk about the control of homeostasis, the example that I gave this afternoon was the receptors that are able to detect temperature. So let's say on the surface of your skin or your integumentary system, you have pressure, touch, pressure, touch, and temperature receptors. They're able to detect huge changes in those particular types of monitors. And so if those receptors receive a specific type of input, that's sent to the control center, and then that control center essentially tells the body how it's going to respond to those alterations in the environment. So again, this is kind of one of the major things that the nervous system does, is the nervous system actually detects the environment around you, sends that information to the control center, aka the brain, and then you get to, well, not necessarily always decide, but your brain is going to regulate the response to the external environment. And so there's going to be some kind of cellular signal response that gets output to the effectors. They're able to mitigate or change that particular type of stimuli disruption that the body is being exposed to. And so you're going to have a response that alters the controlled condition, and then hopefully you can return to homeostasis. So we're going to talk about the two different types of homeostasis. I'm sorry, not the two different types of homeostasis, but the two different types of feedback, both positive and negative. So in the case of negative feedback, the example that you can see here is you're going to have a controlled condition, something like blood pressure. The receptors that are going to detect changes in blood pressure would be the baroreceptors in blood vessels. It's going to lead to nerve impulses that get sent to the control center. Again, the brain is kind of, in most instances, is going to be the control center. The output is going to be nerve impulses that alter things like the effectors and receptors that are expressed on the heart and blood vessels. And so your response will be a decrease in heart rate and the dilation or widening of the blood vessels to cause the blood pressure to decrease. And again, if you have high blood pressure, it's the baroreceptors that detect that, and then it gets sent to the brain. The brain sends out a signal saying, "Hey, heart, we need to, decrease blood pressure by decreasing heart rate or by dilating the blood vessels." So hopefully, by responding in that way, the levels are able to, or your blood pressure is able to return to normal and return to the homeostasis of where your blood pressure wants to be. Another example that could be for negative feedback would be things like temperature. If you have a huge change in temperature, the thermoreceptors in your skin are going to detect that, or even like your core body temperature is going to detect that. It's going to send a signal to your brain, and your brain is basically going to tell your body that it needs to begin to shiver to create kinetic energy, to create some type of heat to warm yourself. And so we're talking about these different kind of pathways, basically to the brain and away from the brain, to the brain. Those would be the afferent pathways, and away from the brain would be the efferent pathways. Afferent towards, efferent away. And for some reason, when I think efferent, I always like breathe in and breathe out. Afferent towards, efferent away. And again, it's just kind of one way that I'm able to kind of remember the different pathway setting. So that's an example of negative feedback. An example of positive feedback would be labor and contraction signals of labor. And so positive feedback, you can almost think of like a snowball rolling down the hill as it's always kind of gaining more and more kind of traction and mass, and it's rolling down. Positive feedback is kind of the same thing. It's kind of this whole cascade of events that has to occur. It doesn't really have a negative feedback situation that happens until the very end of the process, in which the homeostasis is returned to normal. So in the case of, let's say, labor, you have these contractions of the uterus, leads to stretching of the cervix, and then those stretch sensitive receptors set in the cervix lead to control center in the brain. The brain tells the body that it needs to release oxytocin. The oxytocin causes muscles in the wall of the uterus to begin to contract. And the response is the baby's body stretches the cervix more and more. And so this kind of continues to occur until the cervix has reached the right dilation. And again, this is one of those types of feedback systems where you have to kind of continually have kind of an accumulation of that response in order for the final product to occur. And so you have that increased stretching of the cervix that causes the release of more oxytocin, which results in more stretching of the cervix, and this kind of continues until the birth of the infant. So what happens when you have homeostatic imbalances? And kind of like the quick response to that would be disease states. And so homeostasis, again, is very important as a body, as an entity, that all of these things are kind of kept under this very static, regulated manner. And so if you have disruption, you can have disease or disorder or even death. We can think about all of these examples of positive and negative feedback. If those things do not occur, you can't, in extreme cases, it could lead to death, but our body does try to maintain homeostasis in many different ways. And so there are definitely checkpoints that are created within the body's signaling system, that if maybe one part is dysregulated, that another maybe signaling pathway can compensate. So it's important just to recognize that the body does want to maintain life as much as possible, but there are many checks and balances that help maintain homeostasis. Things like genetic makeup, the air you breathe, the food you eat, the thoughts you think can all affect your health. Just a great example of that is at some point during the semester, maybe even this week, you're going to maybe feel stressed out, and the release of stress hormones in your body can actually alter the homeostasis of other signaling molecules in your body, can lead to disruptions in sleep. Again, it's important that you maintain homeostatic balances of sleep. And so stress can be a great example of something that can disrupt the normal homeostasis of the body. Okay, so let's move on and talk a little bit about basic anatomical terminology. So as we go through this course, it's important that you just become familiar with this anatomical terminology. Sometimes we'll be using it in class to describe the position of maybe organs in relation to one another, or where they're located within the body. And so it's important that you kind of get the foundation now that the anatomical terminology. It starts to become part of your normal vernacular, so you can start to utilize these terms in the correct way. So when we talk about anatomical terminology, it's important to recognize that the position of the body is something that is often described by anatomists or doctors or other physicians. Regional names, areas of different areas of the body, directional terms, the way something is kind of pointed in direction to another object, planes and sections. And so we'll talk about planes and sections. This is important probably most for things like imaging or dissections. When you're taking a section and you're cutting or dissecting, let's say, an organism a specific way. And then we'll finish up by talking about the different body cavities. So when we talk about body positions and the anatomical position, these are very standardized ways of talking about the body that kind of gives you a universal anatomical reference. So when you're describing an anatomical position to a physician, or a physician is describing, let's say, an anatomical position to a nurse, or to, let's say, another physician that's thousands of miles away, they have to have kind of a standardized way of describing these things so they understand exactly what they're talking about, because there are so many different ways in which the human body can be orientated. So a person stands erect, facing the observer. Upper extremities are placed at the sides, the palms of the hands are turned forward, and the feet are flat on the floor. So this is kind of the basic standard anatomical position from which kind of all of the descriptions are kind of made. So when we talk about things being located in relation to one another, that's kind of the picture that you should have in your mind of kind of the baseline, body when you start to describe the different body parts in relation to one another. So moving forward, regional names are given to specific regions of the body for reference. So when we talk about things like the cephalic region, we're talking about something that's associated with the head. The cervical region would be the neck. The thoracic region would be the chest. The abdominal region would be within the abdomen. The pelvic region would be the pelvis. And this is all in the anterior view. Again, we'll use terminologies, things like anterior and posterior. Anterior meaning the front, posterior meaning kind of the back. Those are probably the more common words that are used to describe this orientation. So the front is the anterior, the back is the posterior. If we look at the, again, cephalic, cervical, and upper limb on the posterior view, you can also see the lower limb. If we look at the back, that's described as being the dorsal region. The lumbar would be the loin, and then you can also see the sacral region located between the hips. You can see there are also many other terminal words that are used here. Things like, if we look at the anterior view of the cephalic region, you can see the cranial, which is more commonly recognized as the skull. The facial is the face, and then frontal, temporal, orbital, occipital, buccal, nasal, oral, mental. Those are all kind of more specific regions of the cephalic region, or the head region. So again, as you go through this list, just make sure you're kind of taking note of these more specific names as well. If we talk about the axillary region, we'd be talking about more commonly known as the armpit. The brachial region would be the arm. Things like the carpal would be the wrist, the palmar would be the hand, femoral would be the region like the thigh. We often will maybe talk about the femoral artery that's located in the thigh. And again, there are far more specific names that we're going to be talking about here, both the anterior and posterior region. Now, when you're discussing different regions of the body and where they are in relation to one another, directional terms are very important. So it's your ability to precisely locate, or the terminology used to just precisely locate one part of the body relative to another. So in terms of this relationship to one another, if you kind of draw a line down the center of your body, that would be considered your midline. And anything kind of located down that midline would be considered medial, and anything kind of away from that center point of your body would be considered lateral. So you could say that maybe your shoulder is lateral to your sternum. And again, the more examples that you can use for this terminology, the more comfortable you're going to get using them. We talk about proximal versus distal. We can see here the arm is kind of the example that you hear. So your fingers would be distal, your shoulder would be proximal, say, again, in relation to your trunk. And then when we talk about things like superior or inferior, superior is more located to the cephalic region, inferior is kind of farther down the body. So all of these things are going to be in relation to one another, and using these terminologies are important, especially when you're describing, let's say, the location of two anatomical features. So the previous slide was kind of a pictorial representation of these directional terms. Here's kind of like a good example and rundown table. So superior towards the head, the heart is superior to the liver, inferior is away from the head, so the stomach is inferior to the lungs, anterior is near at the front of the body, posterior is at the back, medial is near the midline, so the ulna is medial to the radius. And again, you can see the usage of these, all of these terms are always in relation to another anatomical kind of region, and so you just need to make sure you understand the relationship between those two regions. Lateral, so we just talked about medial, how it's closer to the midline. Lateral would be farther away. Intermediate is going to be located between two structures, and so the example that's given here is the transverse colon is intermediate to the ascending and descending colons. If we talk about things being located on the same side of the body versus the different side of the body, so ipsilateral would be the same side of the body, contralateral would be, let's say, the opposite sides of the body, so your two hands are contralateral to one another, and proximal is another directional term that we use, and it's near to the attachment of the limb of the trunk versus near to the origin of the structure. So again, proximal versus the term distal. So again, your fingertips are going to be distal versus proximal, which maybe your shoulder would be to the midline of your body. Other directional terms, superficial versus deep, especially if you're looking at these terms in a medical field, and let's say you're talking about maybe even a wound. These are also ways wounds are described, being superficial or deep, but you can also use them for specific structures. So let's say the ribs are superficial to the lungs, and deep, the ribs are deep to the skin of the chest and back. So it's just important to recognize, again, all of these terms are used in relationship to one another, and please just make sure that you start to get comfortable using these directional terms kind of more often than you do the more common nomenclature that you might be used to using. Like I said before, when we talk about planes and sections are very important, especially when you're doing different types of images, whether you're doing a CT scan or an X-ray. Knowing the orientation of the body and the plane in which it's taken is very important for context. So you can see here kind of all of the different ways or the planes can be orientated on an individual. You've got your frontal plane. The frontal plane is also called the coronal plane. So if you were going to take yourself and maybe just slice your body from front to back, anterior to posterior, that would be considered the frontal plane. The transverse plane would be if you made slices from essentially the top of the cephalic region down to your feet. That would be considered this transverse plane. The parasagittal plane or the midsagittal plane would be through the parasagittal plane would be through the midline, so you basically would be splitting the body in half, and then you can see down there at the very bottom, the oblique plane is kind of an offset of a plane. It's not really falling on those kind of 90-degree right angles that we see with the other planes. So like I said before, I'm a neuroscientist, and so when we talk about planes and sections, I immediately think about the brain. So a mid-sagittal section would be kind of a slicing of the brain down the middle of it, down its midline point. In most cases, you would be cutting through the corpus callosum, which we'll talk about later on in the semester, and you're splitting that brain in half into the two hemispheres. The frontal section or the frontal plane or what I'd like to call the coronal plane is kind of how you would section a brain if you were sectioning it kind of front to back from, let's say, the olfactory bulbs back to the cerebellum or the occipital lobe. And then lastly, the other type of plane that we see here is the transverse section, where you see kind of the sectioning happening from the very top of the cephalic region to the bottom, or again, if we go back to those terms where we wouldn't necessarily use the terms top and bottom, we would use superior to inferior. So from the superior to the inferior of the brain is exactly the types of terminology we use to describe the transverse section. So in addition to the different planes and sections that we also have different body cavities in which we have the organ systems are located. So body cavities that help are areas of the body that help the body protect, separate, and support the organs. You can see there, kind of in the cephalic region, you have the cranial cavity. The cranial cavity is formed by the cranial bones. You have the vertebral canal, which is going to line the peripheral nervous system and the spinal cord. Um, and then it's kind of the next, the inferior to that, you have the thoracic cavity, and that's going to be the chest cavity. It contains the pleural, the pericardial, and the mediasternum. And again, each one of those cavities themselves is also going to contain specific organs. And so the pleural cavity is going to be that space between the pleura that surrounds the lung. The pericardial would be the space between the layers of the pericardium that surrounds the heart. Mediasternum would be the central portion between the lungs, and it's going to again have a much larger extension of an area. In the abdominal pelvic cavity, you have different regions in here as well. The abdominal cavity, which contains many of the organs in the digestive system, things like stomach, spleen, liver, gallbladder, small intestine, and large intestine. And the pelvic cavity, which contains the urinary bladder, portions of the large intestine, as well as the internal organs for reproduction as well. So each one of these cavities, you can kind of see them separated out into 3 different areas. Each one of them is going to carry a specific set of organ or organ systems important for function. So we're talking about these cavities. It's important to recognize that there are these membranes that are able to kind of divide each one of the cavities. So you have these serous membranes that are kind of these thin double-layered membranes that cover the viscera within the thoracic and abdominal cavities and line the walls of the abdomen and thorax. So you can see that there are 2 different layers here. You have this visceral layer and the parietal layer, each one of them going to be placed in relationship to lining the walls versus the cavity themselves. And because of this lining that you have between these 2 regions, it actually reduces a lot of friction. And we'll talk a little bit later about the importance of water and how water also reduces friction. And I say water, and probably the loosest term, it's actually an aqueous solution that's going to reduce these friction. It's these serous membranes and their location that also reduces friction. So you don't necessarily have this like rubbing or this friction that's caused between the cavities and with the organs themselves. So here's this actually kind of a really great figure showing the position of these membranes, specifically in the thoracic cavity. So here you can see kind of the pleura that are lining outside of the lungs. The parietal pleura and the visceral pleura, again, you have those 2 different pleural regions. The visceral kind of tightly bound around the lungs, the parietal located outside of that. And then the same thing kind of occurs in the heart, where you have the pericardium, you have the parietal pericardium, the pericardial cavity, and the visceral pericardium. And the parietal pericardium is kind of the outermost membrane, and then the visceral pericardium is kind of more tightly bound to the heart itself. And then you have that pericardial cavity is located within them. So it's almost like you have a little buffer bag for these very important organs that help maintain life. If we look at a different kind of vantage point of these serous membranes, you can see from a transverse plane here the region of the pericardial cavity, as well as the pleura as well. It's located around the lungs. So the pericardial cavity, you can kind of see that gap there between the heart and the lungs. That's the pericardial cavity. And then the right pleural cavity and the left pleural cavity, those are also kind of bolded that you can see here in this transverse plane, just showing that space or that gap between the lungs and that outside rib area. So it's important to just recognize here the function of these membranes is to reduce friction, kind of create this protective sac for these different organs and organ systems and allows them to kind of coexist and not necessarily interfere with the function of one another. So we talked about the pleura, we talked about the pericardial cavity. So next let's talk about the peritoneum that covers the abdominal organs. And so when we talk about the abdominal cavity and kind of how those are contained, those are all going to be held within the peritoneum. And again, there are some retroperitoneal organs because they're not surrounded by the peritoneum, but rather they're posterior to it and not included to it. When we talk about all of these different nomenclature, you'll notice that again, we are discussing these different organ systems in relation to one another. But if you were, let's say, looking at the abdomen, you don't necessarily always need to describe something in relationship to one another, but you can also divide the abdomen itself into these regions and quadrants. And so if you look at kind of the regions and quadrants of the abdomen, you can see that you have the right hypochondriac region, the epigastric region, left hypochondriac region, the right lumbar region, the umbilical region, which is kind of the center square where you would find your belly button, the left lumbar region, the left inguinal region, the hypogastric region, and the right inguinal. So each one of these are considered the abdominal pelvic regions. Those are going to be slightly different than the abdominal pelvic quadrants, which you can see is covers a much larger area. But you can, given these different regions, you can actually very specifically describe which area of the abdomen, maybe there's pain, or if there is an organ located within that region, you can describe it as such. So that's kind of the left panel. The right panel, we're looking at the abdominal pelvic quadrants. This is much more, I think, straightforward. You've got your median line down your midline there. And you've got a transumbilical line that kind of divides things transversely from left to right. And you have your right, left, both upper and lower quadrant. Again, this is a little bit more generalized kind of nomenclature used to describe the quadrants versus the abdominal pelvic regions. Both can be used to describe where pain might be located or where a organ system is located. Okay, so today we've discussed or gone over many of the study guide questions for chapter 1. So with today's lecture that's posted, first section, we went over questions 1 through 6. And then tonight, I'll be posting this lecture that I've just finished up. I'll be going over questions 7 through 15. So hopefully we defined homeostasis, talked about the components of a feedback system, contrasted the operation of positive and negative feedback systems, explained how homeostatic imbalances are related to disorders, describe the human body using anatomical positions and specific anatomical terminology, described anatomical position, relate the anatomical names and common names for various regions of the human body, define it, anatomical planes, anatomical sections, and directional terms using the human body. And then we just finished by outlining the major body cavities, organs they contain, and some of their associated linings. So just again, a quick reminder, please make sure that you are finishing up homework 1, your adaptive practice, which is due not Friday, but on Saturday. Quiz 1, your student info sheet, which is due not Friday, but Saturday. Homework 2, which is your adaptive practice due Monday at midnight. Your lectures will be recorded to watch on your own. Lecture 2 has been posted on Moodle. And we'll still be meeting via Zoom each class period, so please make sure you show up next Tuesday at 3:30. Hopefully there will be no technical difficulties. We can begin our discussion of study questions, and I look forward to seeing you all then. So again, please feel free to reach out if you do have any questions or concerns, and I appreciate you all stopping in tonight to watch this video.